Imagine, just for a second, that you're sitting at your kitchen table.
Okay.
You've got your laptop open, maybe a cup of coffee going cold right next to you, and you are just staring at a mortgage application.
A pretty stressful reality for a lot of people right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
And you're watching the interest rate
Uh,
on that screen, and it is, it's hovering at a level you probably haven't seen since right before the 2008 financial crash.
right.
Now, what if I told you that the specific percentage you were looking at,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the actual amount of money you are going to pay every single month for the next 30 years might have just been dictated by a single unconfirmed rumor?
A rumor whispered halfway across the world.
Exactly, whispered in the Middle East. Like, you're looking at a 7% mortgage rate. And the reason you're looking at it is because a planned, highly destructive military strike over Iran was just abruptly canceled.
It sounds totally abstract. I mean, even absurd on the surface.
Yep.
But today, we are going to trace the very real physical wires connecting modern military warfare to your personal bank account and ultimately to the physical reality of artificial intelligence.
Which is wild.
It is. But when we examine the raw mechanics of global power, we find that these seemingly isolated events they're structurally welded together.
So today's deep dive takes a stack of incredible analysis, mostly featuring the insights of a prominent economist, Professor Steve Hanke.
And we should mention, the source material pulls absolutely no punches.
None at all. It gets into the fiscal track records of recent administrations, critiquing both the Trump and Biden presidencies pretty harshly for their economic and geopolitical choices.
Right. And our goal today is not to, endorse those political critiques.
No, got it all.
We're just using them as a map. We are going to look at the mechanics of the arguments presented to understand how the global ecosystem is currently functioning.
Or malfunctioning, really.
Exactly. And to do that, the source materials suggest we need two specific economic lenses to see clearly. First is capital theory.
Which explains the physical constraints of the world.
Right. And the second is the quantity theory of money, which explains the manipulation of our currency. We are going to apply both of these lenses to one specific, highly volatile event.
That canceled U.S. military strike on Iran.
Yeah. Because when you look closely at that single delayed strike, the illusion of separate geopolitical and macroeconomic spheres it completely shatters.
You pull a string in the Strait of Hormuz, and the entire U.S. housing market feels the tension.
Precisely. But to understand why, we have to first understand the sheer scale of the violence that was caused.
So let's talk about the military reality of this planned strike, because it is staggering. The sources get very specific about the hardware that was spun up for this.
They were deploying B-1 bombers.
Right. And the analyst notes that when these strategic bombers go in with their massive payloads, the precision is just almost incomprehensible to the average person.
Oh, it represents the absolute apex of the West's technological dominance.
We are talking about dropping precision-guided munitions from tens of thousands of feet in the air, flying at supersonic speeds.
And being able to hit a target the size of a standard office chair.
An office chair. I mean, from that high up.
Yeah. The engineering behind that involves GPS, satellite constellations, laser targeting, advanced aerodynamics, all working perfectly in sync.
It's crazy.
You've got an aircraft carrying up to 75,000 pounds of ordnance, and it delivers it so perfectly it could take out a specific piece of furniture in a specific room without leveling the entire city block.
It's a terrifying marvel of modern technology.
It really is.
But the source points out this massive fatal flaw in the system. Because with all that apex engineering, the only reason these strikes ever miss their mark isn't a failure of the hardware?
No, it's a failure of the human element, the data.
Right, the intelligence. The analyst gives this really chilling example of a previous strike hitting a school in Iran.
Oh, yeah.
The bomb didn't malfunction. The Blyden system didn't glitch. It hit the exact coordinates it was programmed to hit.
Yeah. The problem was the intelligence hadn't been updated.
Exactly. The database still had that specific building marked as a military target. They were entirely unaware it had been converted into a school.
And that tragic reality perfectly illustrates a vulnerability we are going to see repeatedly today.
Yeah.
You can have the most advanced, surgically precise system in the history of humanity. But if the foundational inputs the intelligence gathering are flawed, the precision simply guarantees a perfectly executed catastrophe.
The machine just executes the bad data flawlessly.
Exactly.
So we have this backdrop. Devastating military capabilities ready to be unleashed. The targets are known. The bombers are fueled and ready.
The analyst even calls the planned attack borderline war crimes. That's how severe and punitive it was intended to be.
Right. And then, abruptly, the entire operation just grinds to a halt. The strike is delayed, and the source introduces the rumor that allegedly jammed the gears of this massive machine.
The message from the Saudi Crown Prince, MBS.
Yeah. He allegedly sent a message implying he would sell off massive amounts of U.S. treasuries if Iran's energy infrastructure was hit, either in the initial attack or in the subsequent retaliation.
Which is where the military standoff instantly becomes a macroeconomic hostage situation.
Let's follow the logic of this threat, though, because on the surface, it feels completely counterintuitive, right? Like Saudi Arabia and Iran are historic, bitter regional rivals.
Oh, absolutely. They've fought proxy wars against each other for decades.
So if Saudi Arabia is ostensibly an ally of the U.S., why would the Saudis threaten to detonate the U.S. economy just to protect Iran's infrastructure?
Well, the Saudis aren't acting out of some sudden diplomatic affection for Tehran.
Right, obviously.
They're calculating pure, pragmatic self-preservation based on physical geography.
Okay, unpack that.
If the U.S. goes in and decimates Iran's military and civilian infrastructure, Iran is going to retaliate with whatever they have left. And from Iran's geographical position, what is the most painful, immediate, and devastating target they can hit?
Not the U.S. mainland.
Exactly. It's thousands of miles away. The target is Saudi Arabia's refining capacity, specifically the massive facilities run by Aramco.
So the Saudi calculation is that an American attack on Iran inevitably results in Iranian missiles falling on Saudi oil fields.
Right. The Crown Prince is looking at the board and realizing that if Iran's back is pushed completely against the wall, they have the capability and the proximity to shut down Saudi Arabia's primary source of wealth.
So MBS steps in.
Yeah, he steps in and essentially draws a line for Washington. If your military adventurism triggers a chain of events that burns my physical energy infrastructure to the ground, I'm going to burn your financial infrastructure to the ground in return.
Wow. But wait, let's test the strength of that threat for a second. Why does a financial threat actually work against the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military on Earth?
It's a great question.
Like, why would the President of the United States back down from a bond sell-off threat when the bombers are already in the air?
Because the U.S. bond market is not just some abstract financial instrument, it is the absolute foundation of the American government's ability to function.
Okay.
The source material notes that the bond vigilantes have aggressively come out of hibernation.
Bond vigilantes. We should probably define that for everyone.
Sure. It's a term coined back in the 1980s. It describes institutional investors who protest inflationary monetary or fiscal policies by aggressively selling bonds.
Okay.
When they dump these bonds onto the open market, they drive the price of the bonds down, which inversely drives the yield, the interest rate the government has to pay up.
And the numbers cited in the source are pretty stark, right?
Very. At the time of this analysis, the 10-year Treasury yield had spiked to nearly 4.8%.
And to put that in context, the source mentions a prominent financial figure, Scott Bessent, had previously identified a 4.5% yield as a critical red line. So we were blowing way past the danger zone.
We were in completely uncharted territory for the modern debt era. And to understand why this terrified Washington into halting a military strike, we have to look at the mechanics of the U.S. deficit through the lens of the quantity theory of money.
Right, the second lens.
The U.S. government is consistently spending trillions of dollars more than it collects in taxes. To cover that gap, the Treasury issues debt. They sell bonds.
Makes sense.
But a massive portion of this debt is short-term paper. Treasury bills that mature in a few months or a few years. When they mature, the government doesn't have the cash to pay off the principal.
So they just issue new debt to pay off the old debt.
Exactly. They are constantly rolling it over.
It's basically like paying off one maxed out credit card by opening a brand new credit card.
That's the perfect analogy. And that strategy only works if the interest rate on the new credit card is low.
Right.
But if Saudi Arabia, which holds a massive portfolio of U.S. debt in its foreign exchange reserves, decides to dump hundreds of billions of dollars of treasuries onto the market all at once...
They flood the supply.
Yes. And when supply drastically outstrips demand, the price of the bonds plummets.
And because bond prices and bond yields move in opposite directions, the yield skyrockets.
Which means the next time the U.S. Treasury goes to auction to roll over its massive multi-trillion-dollar debt, investors are going to demand that sky-high interest rate. The cost of financing the U.S. government would just explode overnight.
And this brings us right back to the kitchen table and the mortgage application.
Yep.
How does a Treasury bond auction in Washington Disrupted by a Saudi threat, alter the 30-year mortgage rate for someone looking to buy a house in, say, Ohio. Like, we need to explain the exact mechanism of how that yield travels from the global bond market directly to a personal bank account.
It comes down to two concepts in financial mechanics: duration matching and opportunity cost.
Okay, walk me through it.
When you take out a 30-year mortgage, the bank issuing that loan doesn't usually keep it. They sell it to entities like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, who bundle thousands of these mortgages into mortgage-backed securities, or MBS.
Right.
Investors buy these securities to earn a steady return over a long period. Now, an investor looking to park their money for a decade or more has a choice.
What are their options?
They can buy a 10-year U.S. Treasury bond, which is considered completely risk-free because the U.S. government can theoretically always print the money to pay it back.
Sure.
Or they can buy a mortgage-backed security, which carries slightly more risk because homeowners can, default or refinance.
So the U.S. Treasury bond is essentially the baseline, the floor.
The absolute floor. It is the risk-free rate of return. Because the mortgage carries more risk, the investor demands a higher yield, a spread above the 10-year Treasury, to make it worth their while.
Okay, I'm following.
So if the 10-year Treasury is yielding 2%, a mortgage investor might demand 4% or 5%. But if the Saudi threat causes the 10-year Treasury yield to spike to 4.8% or 5%, the investor's baseline opportunity cost has shifted.
They're not going to lend money to a home buyer at 5% if they can get a guaranteed 5% from the U.S. government.
Exactly. To attract that investor capital, the mortgage rate has to jump to 7% or 8% just to maintain that risk spread.
So the moment the Saudi crown prince dumps those bonds, the risk-free rate spikes, the spread adjusts, and every single bank in America instantly updates the interest rate on their loan products.
It is an instantaneous mechanical transmission.
Wow.
And the source explicitly points out the real-world consequence of this. The housing market in places like Florida was essentially flatlining during this period of high yields.
Just totally frozen.
Real estate transactions froze because average earners simply could not afford the monthly payments at those elevated rates. The entire housing sector of the economy was being suffocated by the cost of capital.
But look, voters don't necessarily understand the intricate mechanics of the bond market.
No, of course not.
If mortgage rates spike and the housing market freezes,
Yeah.
won't politicians just go on television and blame it on corporate greed or the Federal Reserve or some other domestic boogeyman rather than admitting it was caused by a delayed strike in Iran and a Saudi threat?
They probably would try.
So how does this financial threat actually force the politicians' hands if the public doesn't even immediately see the connection?
Because the politicians might try to spin the narrative for the voters, but they can't spin the balance sheet for the Treasury. The bond vigilantes don't watch Sunday morning political talk shows. They watch the auction metrics.
Nah.
If the Saudis dump the bonds and the yields spike, the immediate, inescapable consequence hits the federal budget, not just the housing market.
And this brings us to a statistic in the source material that is genuinely staggering.
It really is.
Currently, 35% of all U.S. personal income tax revenue collected goes solely to servicing the interest on the government debt.
Right.
I want to make sure you hear that clearly.
All right.
Over a third of every dollar the IRS collects from your paycheck doesn't go to roads. It doesn't go to the military. It doesn't go to health care.
It just pays the interest.
It just keeps the lights on for the debt without even touching the principal.
And the source cites projections from the Congressional Budget Office indicating that if current spending trajectories and elevated interest rates hold, that number is going to shoot up to 50%.
Half.
Half of all personal income tax revenue instantly vaporized by interest payments. The political reality is that no administration can survive a federal budget where half the revenue is consumed by debt service.
They'd have to make catastrophic cuts to essential services.
Sure.
Or push for politically suicidal tax hikes.
Exactly. And the sources are very clear that this fiscal disaster is a thoroughly bipartisan creation.
Yeah, they trace the explosion of massive deficit spending back to the reaction to COVID in February 2020.
The analysts call the first Trump term a fiscal disaster. They state that the Biden administration came in and made the disaster even worse, and that current bipartisan policies are just piling onto the structural rot.
The U.S. government is living paycheck to paycheck on borrowed money.
Which is precisely why the Saudi threat carries absolute, undeniable leverage. The U.S. might possess the B-1 bombers and the precision munitions, but the Saudis hold the debt instruments that finance the fuel for those bombers.
Even the unconcerned rumor of them weaponizing those treasury bonds exposed the Achilles heel of the American empire.
It was a stark demonstration that military dominance is entirely subordinate to macroeconomic stability.
It is just a phenomenal reframing of how global power actually functions in the 21st century. But the source material doesn't just look at the flow of money and the physics of the bond market.
No, it dives deeply into the psychology of the leaders making these decisions.
Utilizing the framework of game theory. Specifically, the analyst relies on a concept detailed in a book by Bill Silber called The Power of Nothing to Lose.
Silber's work provides a really critical analytical lens for understanding why rational actors sometimes choose seemingly irrational, even catastrophic actions. The subtitle of his book focuses on the concept of the Hail Mary pass.
Right, the American football analogy. You are down by 6 points, there are 3 seconds left on the clock, you are pinned deep in your own territory.
Running a standard play guarantees you lose.
So you drop back, throw the ball as far and as high as you can into the end zone, and just pray one of your players comes down with it.
It is the ultimate act of strategic desperation. Game theory dictates that if an actor calculates that they have absolutely nothing left to lose, meaning every conventional option leads to guaranteed failure, their risk tolerance fundamentally alters.
They become willing to try something incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. An action that carries massive collateral damage and a microscopically low probability of success simply because the alternative is a guaranteed unacceptable loss.
And the sources anchor this game theory concept in a very specific, fascinating historical parallel. Adolf Hitler's decision-making process leading up to the 1944 Battle of the Bulge.
And to be absolutely clear up front, the source explicitly states they are not making a moral comparison between the individuals involved today and the Nazi regime.
Right, no. They are strictly comparing the strategic thought process of leaders who find themselves backed into delusional, desperate corners.
The historical mechanics of that decision are essential to understand the modern parallel.
Set the stage for us.
In late 1944, the geopolitical and military situation for Germany was objectively hopeless. The Soviet army was rapidly closing in from the east. D-Day had been successful, and massively superior U.S. and British forces were advancing from the west.
Germany was out of resources, out of manpower, and out of time.
A completely mathematically unwinnable scenario.
By any rational metric, yes. The logical move would be to negotiate a conditional surrender to save whatever was left of the country.
But the source argues that President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a massive strategic and psychological error. Roosevelt publicly and repeatedly demanded unconditional surrender.
He stated there would be no negotiations, no terms, only complete capitulation.
And from the source's perspective, this decree fundamentally altered the game theory matrix for Hitler. Hitler and his inner circle interpreted unconditional surrender not just as losing the war, but as the total annihilation of Germany and their own guaranteed executions.
Therefore, in Hitler's psychological matrix, there was absolutely zero downside to launching a massive, desperate counterattack.
If he surrendered, he lost everything. If he attacked, he would almost certainly lose everything anyway.
But there was a microscopic 1 in a million chance.
Exactly. A chance that a surprise offensive might break the Allied lines, cause a political crisis in Washington or London, and force a negotiated settlement.
So, ignoring the advice of his generals who told him it was a suicidal waste of remaining resources, he fired those who disagreed and launched the Battle of the Bulge.
It was a military Hail Mary born entirely of having nothing to lose.
So, connecting this back to the Middle East, the analyst applies this exact Hail Mary framework to the planned U.S. strike on Iran. The argument is that if the U.S. had actually gone through with this massive bombardment, they would have placed the Iranian regime in the exact same unconditional surrender psychological state.
Precisely. If Iran's civilian and military infrastructure is systematically destroyed, and the regime perceives its survival is existentially threatened by an overwhelming American attack, they no longer have any incentive for restraint.
Deterrence fails completely.
They are in the Hail Mary scenario.
And what does an Iranian Hail Mary look like?
It looks like launching everything they have left in their arsenal at Saudi Arabia's oil fields and mining or completely blocking the Strait of Hormuz.
Wow.
They might know that the U.S. will ultimately destroy them, but they will ensure they take the global energy market, and by extension the global economy, down into the abyss with them.
Which is exactly the chaotic chain reaction the Saudi crown prince recognized, which prompted the threat to dump the bonds to stop the U.S. bombers in the first place.
Exactly.
But what I find truly compelling about the source material is how it turns this game theory framework completely around.
Yes, this is a key point.
The analyst argues that it wasn't just Iran facing a potential Hail Mary situation. They argue that the U.S. strategic position in the Middle East has degraded so severely that the planned military strike itself was, in reality, an American Hail Mary.
The source paints a detailed, systemic picture of a U.S. foreign policy architecture that has relentlessly collapsed across multiple metrics over the last several decades.
Leaving aggressive, high-risk military action as the only perceived tool left in the toolbox.
The analyst details a cascading narrative of 8 compounding strategic failures regarding U.S. policy in Iran, leading directly to this moment of desperation.
It's not just a list, it's a domino effect of geopolitical miscalculations. Let's trace how one failure inevitably led to the next, starting with the primary overarching goal, regime change.
For decades, the implicit and often explicit goal of U.S. pressure campaigns, sanctions, and covert operations has been to fracture the Iranian government and instigate regime change.
And that foundational goal has completely failed.
Totally. The regime has not only survived the economic strangulation, but has arguably entrenched itself further, using the external threat of the U.S. to unify domestic control.
And because the U.S. failed to change the regime, but succeeded in threatening them existentially, the regime logically pursued the ultimate insurance policy.
Nuclear enrichment.
Right. The source notes that since the abandonment of the Obama-era nuclear agreement during the first Trump term, Iran has rapidly accelerated its enrichment of nuclear material.
The attempt to stop their progress actually accelerated it.
But enriched uranium sitting in a lab doesn't provide deterrence. You need a way to deliver it.
Which leads to the third cascading failure, Iran's development of intact, highly capable, long-range ballistic missiles.
Despite all the technological embargoes and export controls, the U.S. has failed to curb Iran's ability to engineer and mass-produce delivery payloads capable of striking deep into Allied territory.
And a regime armed with ballistic missiles and a booming nuclear program needs asymmetric leverage to keep its enemies off balance.
Which brings us to the fourth failure, the explosion of Iranian proxy groups.
The U.S. has entirely failed to dismantle Iran's network of proxies. Organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis have become vastly more sophisticated, acting as a decentralized forward defense for Tehran.
And it is those exact proxy groups that executed the fifth systemic failure.
The functional closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea maritime routes.
Right. The Houthis, armed and funded by Iran, have managed to effectively choke off one of the most vital maritime transit corridors in the global economy using cheap drones and anti-ship missiles.
The U.S. Navy, despite its massive technological superiority, has been unable to guarantee freedom of navigation, which is a historic strategic loss.
If you look at the mechanics of that maritime closure, it's fascinating. I mean, the Houthis don't even have to hit every ship.
No, they just have to hit a few.
Which causes global maritime insurance premiums to skyrocket. Once the insurance costs become astronomical, the shipping companies voluntarily reroute around the entire continent of Africa.
Adding weeks to transit times and massively inflating supply chain costs, it is an economic chokehold applied with relatively primitive weapons.
And that hostile environment forces the sixth failure, the retreat of American physical power.
The source highlights something that rarely gets prominent coverage. Due to constant harassment by these proxy forces, U.S. troops have effectively been forced to abandon or drastically reduce their footprint in traditional forward operating bases in the Gulf.
They've had to fall back to perceived safer locations, like Jordan.
Which, tragically, proved to be an illusion of safety, as we saw with the lethal drone strike on U.S. troops stationed at Tower 22 in Jordan.
The retreat didn't buy security, it just relocated the vulnerability.
Exactly. And when a superpower is seen retreating and failing to protect maritime routes, its regional alliances inevitably fracture.
Which is the seventh failure.
We spent the first segment detailing how the Saudi crown prince felt confident enough to leverage the U.S. bond market against the president. That is the definition of a frayed alliance.
The Gulf states no longer view the U.S. as an omnipotent protector. They view the U.S. as an erratic, declining partner, and they are hedging their bets accordingly.
Which naturally results in the final structural failure, the empowerment of global rivals.
Right. The source argues that the chaos, the power vacuums, and the strategic exhaustion of the U.S. have created a massive opportunity that is being aggressively exploited by a new axis of power.
Russia, Turkey, and primarily China.
The culmination of these 8 failures leaves U.S. policymakers looking at a board where every conventional diplomatic and economic tool has broken.
The sanctions didn't work, the naval patrols didn't work, the alliances are crumbling.
So, in their desperation, they revert to the only tool that still technically functions. the B-1 bombers.
The planned strike was the U.S. throwing a Hail Mary because they felt they had nothing else left to lose in the region.
But I have to push back on the internal logic of the policymakers here. If a strategy is demonstrably failing on 8 different, highly complex metrics, how could anyone rational believe that dropping bombs would fix it?
That's the billion-dollar question.
I mean, throwing a Hail Mary might be desperate, but it still has a microscopic chance of scoring a touchdown. Dropping munitions on Iran doesn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz, it doesn't unfray the Saudi alliance, and it certainly doesn't stop China's rise.
No.
Doesn't this strike guarantee they lose the geopolitical game while simultaneously crashing the domestic economy?
You're hitting on the exact cognitive dissonance the source material is critiquing. The policymakers in Washington often view these geopolitical actions in a vacuum, detached from domestic economic consequences.
Interesting.
Military actions in the Middle East, abandoned bases, proxy wars, even tragic casualties remain largely abstract to the average American voter, provided the domestic economy continues to function.
So the political class can ignore the 8 strategic failures as long as the stock market is up and unemployment is low.
The consequences are exported.
Exactly, until the Saudi threat changes the equation.
The brilliance of MBS's maneuver is that it took the failure out of the abstract realm of foreign policy and weaponized it against the domestic U.S. economy.
By threatening the bond market, the Saudis ensured that the consequence of the U.S. Hail Mary would be felt instantly in every mortgage payment and credit card bill in America.
It forced Washington to realize that the ultimate cost of their military desperation wouldn't just be paid in the Middle East, it would be paid on Main Street.
That structural reality brings us to the broader geopolitical map. We just discussed the empowerment of rivals, and the source indicates that the conflicts we are seeing aren't staying neatly contained in their respective regions.
No, we are witnessing a dangerous merging of global front lines.
This is one of the most critical analytical observations in the source text. In the West, we have a tendency to view the war in Ukraine and the various conflicts in the Middle East as distinct, separate geopolitical events.
But the analysts argue that the key players on the ground do not view them that way at all. They're increasingly engineering a single, interconnected theater of war.
The source specifically asserts that leaders like Ukraine's Zelensky and Israel's Netanyahu share a common strategic goal. They actively want to merge these wars.
They want to entangle the United States so deeply in a global confrontation that it becomes politically and logistically impossible for Washington to extract itself or pivot its attention elsewhere.
If you look at it through their strategic lens, the logic is sound, even if it is incredibly dangerous for the U.S.
Right. If a nation is fundamentally reliant on U.S. financial and military support for its survival, its absolute biggest fear is American isolationism or strategic fatigue.
If Ukraine or Israel fights in isolation, they risk the U.S. public getting bored or frustrated with the cost.
But if they can convince Washington that fighting in their specific theater is intrinsically, unavoidably linked to defeating America's primary adversaries everywhere else, tying Iran to Russia and Russia to China, they guarantee a continuous, open-ended flow of American resources.
And the source brings up a highly specific, honestly shocking tactical detail to illustrate this intentional merging of conflicts. They detail a military incident that occurred in the Caspian Sea.
The Caspian Sea incident perfectly illustrates the hidden architecture of modern warfare.
Let's set the geography for a moment. The Caspian Sea is a massive landlocked body of water completely surrounded by Russia, Iran, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan.
There is no open ocean access.
Yet the source alleges that Ukraine managed to strike an Iranian ship operating inside this landlocked sea.
Which is wild.
For a military currently fighting a brutal ground war on its own soil, to project force into a distant landlocked sea surrounded by hostile nations is an absurd logistical hurdle.
The analysts, citing their own high command sources, points out the obvious reality. Ukraine simply does not possess the independent satellite infrastructure or the signal's intelligence capability to track and target a moving vessel in the Caspian.
The implication made by the source is clear. There is only one nation on Earth with a pervasive intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance network capable of providing the real-time targeting data required for a strike of that nature in that specific location.
The United States.
Now, this is presented as a second-hand assertion by the analysts. But whether it is absolute fact or simply perceived as fact by Moscow and Tehran, the effect is the same.
It completely shatters the carefully maintained illusion that the U.S. is merely an observer providing financial aid.
It demonstrates Ukraine acting kinetically against Iranian assets, allegedly utilizing American intelligence, physically and strategically welding the two conflicts together.
It forces Russia and Iran into a tighter operational alliance. And while this entanglement consumes the energy and resources of the United States, the real winners, according to the source, are standing on the sidelines collecting the spoils.
Russia, Turkey, and China are forming a new axis of influence, and what is fascinating is where they are concentrating their efforts.
They aren't just looking at the active battlefields, they are laser-focused on Central Asia.
The source spends a significant amount of time detailing how Central Asia is becoming the invisible battleground for the 21st century. They zero in specifically on Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. Let's start with the pipeline politics of Azerbaijan.
The analyst describes the country as an incredible crossroads for global intelligence operatives.
To understand why Azerbaijan is crawling with spies, you have to look at the map through the lens of physical energy infrastructure.
Azerbaijan sits directly between Russia and Iran, functioning as a geographical bridge between Europe and Asia.
The source notes that there is a massive multinational push to entirely reorganize the flow of energy out of the Eurasian continent.
The goal is to physically redraw the energy map to bypass the adversaries.
Exactly. The West wants to reroute pipelines away from China's Belt and Road Initiative, and critically, away from any territory controlled by Russia or Iran.
The plan, detailed in the sources, involves building massive, highly complex pipeline systems that originate in Azerbaijan, completely bypass northern Iran, snake through the contested territories of northern Iraq, cut across Syria, and ultimately terminate at export facilities in Turkey and parts of Israel.
You are talking about laying hundreds of miles of steel pipe through some of the most politically volatile, heavily militarized terrain on the planet.
It is a logistical nightmare.
Which is why the intelligence services are so active there. It's not just about energy, it's about control.
Whichever axis controls the physical transit routes of that energy controls the economic destiny of Europe and Asia.
This also explains the seemingly bizarre geopolitical realignments we've seen recently, such as NATO member Turkey heavily supporting Azerbaijan in its recent military conflicts with Armenia.
It wasn't just ethnic solidarity. It was about securing the territory necessary for that specific energy corridor.
And right across the Caspian Sea from Azerbaijan is Kazakhstan, a geographically massive nation that the source notes is incredibly rich in all the physical goodies that global predators require to run modern economies: rare earth minerals, oil, natural gas, and uranium.
Kazakhstan is essentially a massive periodic table sitting in the middle of the Asian continent.
But the source also highlights a darker side to this resource rush. They bring up serious allegations of corruption involving American elites in Kazakhstan.
Specifically, they name-drop the controversy surrounding figures like Hunter Biden and Jared Kushner, suggesting they have been involved in attempts to secure access to the region's vast wealth.
Now, our purpose here is not to litigate the legal validity of those specific claims, but the fact that the analysts highlight them demonstrates that Central Asia is viewed globally as a Wild West gold rush.
It is a territory where geopolitical influence and elite personal enrichment are inextricably linked.
It proves that the Great Game, the historical contest for supremacy in Central Asia, is alive and well. But you simply cannot discuss this region or this new global axis without addressing the massive walking contradiction that is Turkey.
Turkey is fascinating. The source points out the wild, almost schizophrenic complexity of their current geopolitical role.
On paper, Turkey is a vital member of NATO. They have the second largest standing military in the alliance behind the U.S. They theoretically share the strategic goals of Washington and Brussels.
Yet the analyst notes they have a deep-rooted historical precedent, echoing back to the Ottoman era of playing multiple sides simultaneously.
They are the ultimate geopolitical swing state.
They house American nuclear weapons at Incirlik Air Base, while simultaneously purchasing advanced S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems from Russia.
They supply highly effective drones to Ukraine, while acting as a massive conduit for Russian money evading Western sanctions.
They support Azerbaijan's energy corridor while maintaining complex trade relations with Iran.
They are dancing on several different stools at once, trying to extract concessions from everyone. But then, the source drops this absolute bombshell claim.
Yeah, quoting former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett,
who allegedly indicated that Israel's next major target, after dealing with Iran, will be Turkey.
That statement, if indicative of actual Israeli strategic planning, is astoundingly complex when you consider the legal treaty obligations involved.
Let's wargame that out for a second. If Israel were to launch a preemptive strike against Turkey, what on earth does the United States do?
Article 5 of the NATO treaty dictates that an attack on one is an attack on all.
Does Washington defend its NATO ally, Turkey, against an attack? Or does Washington support its historic, heavily armed ally, Israel?
It creates a paradox that breaks the fundamental architecture of the post-WWII order. It shows just how convoluted, contradictory, and fragile these alliances have become.
The old rulebook isn't just outdated. It has been completely shredded by the reality on the ground.
And while all these regional powers, Israel, Iran, Turkey, Russia, are playing multi-dimensional chess with missiles and pipelines, bleeding resources, and political capital, the source argues that China is quietly winning the real game without firing a shot.
They note a staggering metric. China's international favorability rating is now demonstrably higher globally than that of the United States.
And we are seeing the practical economic application of that favorability play out in real time on the oceans.
The source notes that while the U.S. Navy struggles to keep the Red Sea open through force, China took a different route.
They successfully negotiated directly with the Houthis to guarantee that Chinese-flagged cargo ships would be granted safe, unmolested passage through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb.
That is an incredible visual. You have American and European vessels being targeted by drones and forced to reroute around Africa at massive expense, while Chinese cargo glides right through the combat zone for free.
Simply because they are viewed favorably or at least neutrally by the actors disrupting the system.
China is reaping the massive economic benefits of the chaos, while the U.S. is bogged down trying to police it.
But the source argues that China's real leverage isn't just geopolitical neutrality. Their true advantage is technological.
And this brings us to a massive structural transition in our deep dive today. We've established that the U.S. cannot afford the geopolitical wars necessary to secure global supply lines.
But losing that influence doesn't just mean losing access to cheap oil in the Middle East.
No.
Okay.
It means losing control over the physical supply chains that power the crown jewel of the American economy, Silicon Valley.
Let's look at why Wall Street's current obsession with artificial intelligence is fundamentally threatened by these exact same shifting global powers.
This is perhaps the most contrarian and arguably the most important economic argument presented in the entire source text.
The analyst levels a fundamental critique against the current valuation of the U.S. stock market, which has been driven to historic highs almost entirely by the promise and hype of artificial intelligence.
The source argues that Wall Street analysts and venture capitalists are making a massive systemic category error. They are suffering from a delusion that we can call the marginal cost fallacy.
To understand this fallacy, we have to look at the history of tech valuations. For the last 2 decades, the massive boom in tech wealth has been driven by software.
And the beautiful thing about software, economically speaking, is that the marginal cost of reproducing it is essentially zero.
Let's define that clearly. If a company develops a new app or a new operating system, they have to spend a massive amount of money up front.
It might cost them $1 billion in developer salaries to write the initial code. That is their fixed cost.
But once the code is written, what is the cost of creating the second copy of that software? Or the billionth copy?
It's practically nothing. They just hit copy-paste. The marginal cost, the cost of producing one additional unit is zero.
And because the marginal cost is zero, the profit margins are astronomical. Wall Street has spent 20 years conditioning itself to evaluate tech companies based on this zero marginal cost model.
They see massive upfront investment, followed by infinite, virtually free scalability.
The source argues that the fatal error the market is making right now is applying this exact same software framework to artificial intelligence.
They're looking at AI models like ChatGPT and thinking, okay, this is just really, really smart software. They spent billions to train the model, but now that it's built, they can let it run for free forever.
But the analyst points out that this assumption violates the laws of physics.
AI is not just software.
It is profoundly reliant on heavy hardware and massive physical resource consumption. The marginal cost of running an AI query is not zero. It is overwhelmingly positive, highly tangible, and incredibly expensive.
This is where capital theory becomes essential. We have to look at the physical constraints of production.
The source explicitly lists the actual physical costs required every single time someone queries an advanced AI model.
Let's break down the physics of this because it is staggering. First, you need electricity. Massive grid-straining amounts of power just to run the data centers.
The computational intensity of a generative AI query is exponentially higher than a simple Google search. You aren't just retrieving information. The neural network is actively calculating probabilities across billions of parameters in real time.
That requires the servers to run at maximum capacity, drawing immense amounts of electricity.
And when electronics draw that much power, they generate an incredible amount of heat. Which brings us to the second physical constraint: water.
To prevent these massive server farms from literally melting down, they require advanced cooling systems.
And we aren't talking about a few desk fans. We are talking about industrial-scale water evaporation systems.
These data centers consume millions of gallons of fresh water, often drawing directly from local water tables in areas that are already facing drought conditions.
The thermal dynamics of AI require a constant sacrifice of physical resources.
And the third constraint is the hardware itself. You need a constant supply of highly advanced microchips, specifically GPUs.
These chips degrade under the intense heat and continuous workload. They have to be constantly replaced.
And manufacturing these chips brings us to the most surprising constraint mentioned in the source: helium.
Helium is an absolutely critical, irreplaceable component in semiconductor manufacturing.
Why? I think most people associate helium with party balloons, not supercomputers.
It comes down to atomic properties. Helium is an inert gas, meaning it doesn't react with other chemicals.
Okay.
When you are etching transistors onto a silicon wafer at a microscopic scale, we are talking 3 nanometers wide, the slightest impurity in the air can ruin the entire batch.
The manufacturing must take place in an absolute vacuum, or in an environment flooded with an inert gas like helium to prevent contamination.
Furthermore, helium has incredible thermal conductivity. It can cool the manufacturing equipment rapidly and efficiently.
Without a steady supply of helium, the production of advanced AI chips completely halts.
And the source notes that major global helium supplies are currently facing severe disruptions and cutoffs, often controlled by nations that are not friendly to the United States.
So if we synthesize this through capital theory, you have a technology, AI, that Wall Street assumes can scale infinitely for free.
But the physical reality is that every single unit of scale requires you to burn more coal or natural gas for electricity,
Boil more fresh water,
degrade expensive physical silicon.
and consume irreplaceable inert gases that are controlled by geopolitical adversaries.
The critique used an analogy to explain this, so let's use it to really hammer this point home. Treating AI like traditional software is like valuing a massive, heavy industrial physical factory as if it were a digital PDF document.
A PDF you can duplicate and email 1,000,000 times for free.
But every single time you ask an advanced AI a question, gears have to turn in a server farm somewhere, burning actual fossil fuels, boiling actual water, and degrading physical microchips.
Wall Street is currently pricing an industrial factory as if it's a PDF.
That analogy perfectly captures the absurdity of the current market valuations. And because of this massive physical marginal cost, the source argues that the grand vision of AI replacing all human labor across the economy is fundamentally flawed.
The professor quoted in the source used a very specific dismissive phrase regarding the idea that AI will replace everyone. Lots of luck, baby.
His argument is grounded in simple cost-benefit analysis. Because the marginal cost of running the AI is so physically expensive, you are only going to deploy it for incredibly high-value tasks.
You are not going to spend a fortune in electricity, water, and compute power just to replace a mid-level office worker who manually updates a spreadsheet.
In many sectors of the economy, human labor remains significantly cheaper than machine labor. Therefore, the widespread utopian adoption of AI across every single sector is going to hit a massive, insurmountable financial wall.
And while Silicon Valley and Wall Street are busy inflating this massive hype bubble based on flawed mathematics, the source points out what China has been doing.
And it is the exact antithesis of software hype. They have been engaged in a multi-decade strategy focused entirely on mastering physical reality.
The analyst introduces a foundational concept of Chinese economic strategy that began heavily following Deng Xiaoping's reforms in 1979. It is called the strategy of the 3 M's: mining, metallurgy, and material science.
The absolute physical building blocks of the modern industrial world.
Precisely. Over the last 40 years, while the West focused obsessively on software development, financialization, and the service economy, China focused aggressively on digging raw materials out of the earth, refining those materials, and engineering them into physical products.
The source notes a terrifying academic statistic. The top university departments in the world for mining, engineering, and metallurgy are now heavily concentrated in China.
They are rapidly overtaking the West in advanced material science.
The human capital disparity mentioned in the source is staggering. They estimate that China is currently producing thousands upon thousands of highly trained engineers every year, orders of magnitude more than the United States and the rest of the Western world combined.
So when you analyze the global race for AI dominance through the lens of capital theory, the picture is grim for the U.S.
You have America throwing trillions of dollars of speculative printed capital at software models that require hyper-expensive physical infrastructure to run.
And on the other side, you have China, who controls the global mining operations, dominates the metallurgy to refine the rare earth minerals, advances the material science, and possesses a massive army of engineers capable of building the physical infrastructure.
The analyst's conclusion is that China will inevitably win the AI race, not necessarily because they have better coders, but because they own the supply chain for that hyper-expensive fuel.
They will be able to produce the high-quality physical infrastructure required for AI much, much cheaper than the West.
Which brings us to the impending, catastrophic economic threat facing the United States. The source describes it as a double bubble that is getting ready to burst.
Okay, I want you to walk me through the mechanics of this double bubble. How does it pop?
The first bubble is the valuation bubble. This is the marginal cost fallacy we just detailed. Investors are paying astronomical, historically unprecedented prices for AI stocks based on the false assumption that they function like zero-cost software.
The analyst predicts this bubble will violently pop when the AI enthusiasts finally get mugged by reality.
Reality meaning the quarterly earnings reports where the companies have to admit how much they are spending on electricity and GPUs.
Exactly. When the physical costs become undeniable, the valuations will crater.
But the danger is compounded by the second bubble, the earnings bubble. The source claims that current corporate earnings across the broader stock market are currently running about 60% higher than their historical long-term trend line.
And in economics, everything eventually reverts to the mean.
They always revert to the mean. So you have inflated valuations based on hype, and you have inflated corporate earnings across the board that are statistically due for a massive downward correction.
But what turns this from a correction into a catastrophe is when we tie this tech analysis all the way back to the beginning of our deep dive.
We have to bring the bond market back in.
This is where it all locks together. The geopolitical threat from Saudi Arabia to dump bonds drives yields up. The massive U.S. government deficit spending, fueled by inflation, drives yields up.
So we are trapped in a permanently high interest rate environment. How do high interest rates trigger the tech collapse?
It comes down to how Wall Street models the value of a stock.
The value of any company is theoretically the sum of all its future earnings. But a dollar earned 10 years from now is worth less than a dollar today.
So financial analysts use a formula to discount those future earnings back to a present-day value. And the crucial input in that formula, the discount rate, is heavily based on the risk-free rate of the 10-year Treasury bond.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, if the 10-year Treasury yield spikes because the Saudis dump bonds or the deficit spirals out of control, the discount rate in those financial models spikes simultaneously.
You've just found the detonator. When the discount rate goes up, the present value of those distant hypothetical future earnings plummets exponentially.
Tech stocks, particularly AI companies, are valued almost entirely on massive earnings projected 10 or 20 years into the future.
So it's a perfect, inescapable storm. The AI hype dies because investors realize the physical costs of power and cooling are too high. General corporate earnings revert to their historical mean, dropping 60%.
And whatever meager future earnings are left get aggressively, brutally discounted by skyrocketing interest rates caused by a sovereign debt crisis.
Everything collapses simultaneously. The tech stock valuations crater, wiping out trillions in wealth. The Treasury bond prices are already tanking.
Mortgage rates remain sky high, suffocating the middle class, and the federal government is forced to spend half of its tax revenue just to service the interest on the debt.
So, stepping back from the financial models, what is the ultimate bill for this reality? We started this deep dive looking at a planned military strike on Iran.
We've established the U.S. economy is balancing on a knife's edge.
If the political class in Washington were to engage in a new, expanded conflict in the Middle East to try and reverse their strategic failures, what would it actually cost?
The source provides a very stark, sobering reality check on the mathematics of modern warfare, pointing out how terribly the government estimates these costs on the front end.
They use the first Iraq War as the prime example of this deception. The initial estimate provided to the American public and Congress was that the war would cost roughly $200 billion.
Which is a massive sum, but conceptually manageable for the U.S. budget. However, the reality of war is never confined to the initial theater of operations.
The analyst cites the comprehensive research from the Brown University Cost of War Project, which attempts to calculate the total, long-term, real economic costs of conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan over a 50-year horizon.
What are they factoring in that the initial estimates leave out?
They factor in the physical realities of the aftermath, the immense, multi-decade cost of providing medical care and disability benefits for millions of wounded veterans.
The massive macroeconomic drag of removing productive citizens from the workforce.
But crucially, tying back to the quantity theory of money, they calculate the compounding interest on the trillions of dollars the government had to borrow to fight the war in the first place.
You aren't just paying for the bomb, you are paying interest on the money you borrowed to build the bomb for the next 30 years.
And the source notes that when you calculate all of those factors, the Brown University multiplier is roughly 25x.
You take whatever initial estimate the Pentagon gives the public and you multiply it by 25 to find the true eventual cost.
The source estimates that the combined real cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars will ultimately end up somewhere between $4 and $5 trillion.
So if we apply that grim multiplier to the prospect of a new, massive military entanglement with Iran, the analyst estimates that just the initial out-of-pocket front-end cost would quickly surpass $1 trillion.
$1 trillion that we just spent an hour establishing the U.S. government absolutely does not have.
They would have to issue another $1 trillion in treasury bonds, flooding the market, driving yields even higher, further angering the bond vigilantes, and crushing the domestic economy even faster.
It is a vicious, accelerating death spiral, which leads to a very sharp, uncompromising political critique from the source material.
Yes, the analyst directs their ire at what they define as the bipartisan fusion party operating in Washington, D.C.
They specifically point out the veneration of politicians who constantly advocate for foreign intervention, noting that this is a totally bipartisan phenomenon.
Heavyweight Democrats and Republicans alike elevate and celebrate figures who constantly push for the next military entanglement, regardless of the fiscal reality.
The critique presented in the source is that this political class is entirely structurally disconnected from the economic realities of average citizens.
They ask a pointed question. How does an endless proxy war in the Middle East or Eastern Europe tangibly benefit a working-class voter in a place like South Carolina or Ohio?
The source suggests it doesn't. They argue these interventions only truly benefit the defense contractors, the military-industrial complex, and the political actors who receive their lobbying funds.
They argue that the political establishment in D.C. is intellectually bankrupt and morally unmoored, completely disconnected from the domestic prosperity they are sworn to prioritize.
Instead, they push for global wars that the country literally cannot afford to fight, funded by debt that will eventually crush the citizens.
It is a damning structural assessment of the incentives built into modern American politics.
And to make sense of this incredibly chaotic, interconnected picture, the wars, the national debt, the physical constraints of AI, the pipeline politics of Central Asia, the expert source offers you a framework.
A macroeconomic cheat sheet to cut through the noise.
They call it the 80-20 rule of macroeconomics. The assertion is that if you want to understand 80% of what is actually happening in the world economy, you can ignore the political rhetoric and focus solely on combining two specific disciplines.
We introduced them at the beginning. The first is capital theory.
The analyst references a book they co-authored called Capital, Interest, and Weighting.
This discipline forces you to look at how physical capital is formed, how time and interest rates dictate investment, and most importantly, the inescapable physical constraints of production.
It is the lens that allows you to see that AI is not magical software, but a heavy industrial process reliant on physical minerals, water, and energy.
And the second discipline is the quantity theory of money, referencing another foundational text, Making Money Work.
This lens focuses on the mathematical reality of the money supply, inflation, and how central banks and massive government deficits fundamentally dilute the value of currency, driving up yields and destabilizing governments.
If you understand how physical capital is constrained and valued in reality, and you understand how the money supply is manipulated by politics, you possess the analytical lens to see through 80% of the geopolitical maneuvering happening on the global stage.
Which is exactly the journey we've taken you on today. We started by looking at a rumor of dumped bonds in Saudi Arabia, which effectively stopped a B-1 bomber over the Persian Gulf.
We used our lenses to see how that canceled strike connects to the physical pipeline politics in the mountains of Azerbaijan and the resource rush in Kazakhstan.
We examined how those exact same physical resources, the mining, the metallurgy, the helium, are the hidden, heavy industrial bottlenecks that are preparing to violently pop the zero marginal cost AI bubble in Silicon Valley.
All while a heavily engineering-focused Chinese state quietly builds the physical infrastructure to dominate the next century.
We traced how throwing a geopolitical Hail Mary in the Middle East can instantaneously crash a domestic housing market in Florida.
And we explored how the massive multi-trillion-dollar reality of warfare is consistently ignored by a bipartisan political class that seems addicted to foreign entanglement at the expense of domestic stability.
It all connects. None of these global events exist in isolation. The boundaries between foreign policy and domestic economics are completely illusory.
The interest rate on your credit card, the mortgage rate you stared at on your laptop screen, is directly, inextricably tied to the geopolitical chessboard.
The pragmatic calculations of a foreign crown prince or the targeting data of a strategic bomber dictate the literal cost of your everyday life.
And that reality leads to a final, provocative thought that emerges from synthesizing all of this source material. Something for you to deeply consider as you watch the news.
We are constantly told by Silicon Valley and the media that the future belongs entirely to artificial intelligence, to software, to the ethereal digital realm.
But if the actual future of technology requires massive, escalating amounts of physical resources, power grids, water tables, rare earth minerals, helium just to function?
And if the supply chains for those physical resources are increasingly located in or aggressively controlled by a rival geopolitical axis that is heavily focused on real-world engineering rather than software hype.
Are we looking at a future where a tech company's biggest hurdle isn't writing more efficient code or securing venture capital funding?
Are we looking at a future where the ultimate insurmountable bottleneck for technological advancement is actually foreign policy?
If the servers require rare earth minerals and inert gases to run, and the new global axis controls the mines and the refineries, Silicon Valley might soon find itself having to answer to foreign diplomats rather than domestic developers.
It is a completely fundamentally different world than the digital utopia we thought we were building. I want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning those surface-level narratives. Keep looking for the hidden wires connecting the physics to the finance. And remember that when the machinery of global politics seems chaotic or irrational, there is always a deeper structure underneath if you have the lenses to see it.